Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. We'll just wait for everyone to come in. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll just give it a minute or so until I see the numbers are stable, because they still come in one by one. Right, I think that's pretty stable now. Thank you so much for joining, everyone, on this Kronos Hub webinar on preprint posting and open access publishing. My name is Romy Beard. I'm the head of publisher relations at Kronos Hub, and I organize our monthly webinars, thought leadership webinars, where we try and get organizations from different areas in the scholarly communications landscape together to talk about open access related topic. Kronos Hub is an open access management platform. We work with funders, institutions, and publishers in variously different ways. So today we'll talk about preprint posting and open access publishing. And I've got our two speakers here with me, Ben Modrag from ChemArchive and Philip Cohen from SocArchive. I hope I said that properly. Just a couple of housekeeping things. There's a chat box, there's a Q&A. Please feel free to post questions at any point, and we'll try and bring them into the discussion. We'll have short presentations first by each of our speakers, and then we'll have a good half an hour of discussion where we can have some prepared discussion points and questions that I will ask, but also if you guys have any questions, please put them in the chat and the Q&A. And I will have a look at that. And the webinar is also recorded, so the recording will be made available afterwards. So don't feel like you need to take loads of notes. So before I hand over to Ben, our first speaker, I just wanted to spend a minute to talk very briefly about what we're talking about when we're talking about preprints and the relationship between posting a preprint and open access publishing. And I thought it might be helpful to have this very brief definition. So in my head, preprint posting is really the article written by the author that hasn't been reviewed yet, which might be the same version that they'd later go on to submit to a journal from publishing. Archiving, on the other hand, a lot of the time is the AAM, so the reviewed version, not the final published version, but a version that has been reviewed. So often the author accepted manuscript version that would be archived, as in deposited in an institutional repository or in another repository. And then as a third version, you'd have, I'd say, open access publishing, which is when a final article is put on the publisher's website, either closed access or open access. And this version has been both peer reviewed and also edited. There's layout, there's typesetting added. So there's some interesting announcement recently about peer-reviewed preprints. Maybe we can get to that as well. But I just thought I'd put that there as an introduction before I hand over to Ben to talk about ChemArchive and preprints in general a little bit. Thank you so much, Ben.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm Ben Modrag. I'm the product manager at ChemArchive. ChemArchive is a chemistry-focused preprint server, as you could probably tell by the name. It was launched in 2017. It's a collaborative effort from 5 different chemical societies around the world. You can see their logos there at the bottom. At this point, we've reached just about 15,000 preprints. In fact, I was going to look on the website today. We've hit over 15,000 since I made this, just to give you a sense, and just to have a few of the metrics up there. But it is open, free to use, free to read, just like most other preprint servers. So why don't you go to the next slide? We can talk a little bit about give you a sense of the growth. So like anything, it takes a little time to build up, but don't have to squint at all the numbers, but I've just to give you a sense of how preprints posted to ChemArchive and how they've been used, like viewed and downloaded, what that's looked like over the past few years. We're at the point of posting about 450 preprints a month. I've got the details there for how often they're viewed, but I think you can all see that 2020 was a pretty big spike, especially in people wanting to read and download the content. And it really timed right alongside a lot of lab shutdowns during the pandemic. And maybe that's something also that Social Archive saw, but it is, yeah, we're growing slowly. I think chemistry is maybe a late field to the game, but it is still something that seems to be catching its stride in the community. All right, you can go to the next one. Okay, so what is it that, and I'm speaking from the perspective of ChemArchive, obviously, but I think that this reflects probably some similar goals that are shared by other preprint services and other open science groups in general. So we see that's the goals for preprints, like why host a preprint server in chemistry. Wanted an opportunity for scientists to gather feedback. Obviously, you can do it in a very sort of personal and one-on-one setting, but you can also do it in a way that is more open, where you can post it and you don't know necessarily who's going to contact you. It could lead to new opportunities for collaborations and just for catching things, expanding your work, making it more relevant, all those kind of things. It certainly helps with more rapidly disseminating the content. So this is a way to say, you know, whenever you feel like your story is ready, you can put it up and you're not subject to what could take months or even a year to go through a peer review process, or perhaps in multiple journals. You can still take that route, but in the meantime, you have a copy of it that's available for people to learn from. And at the same time, by posting it first and early, you get to establish priority for it. So if it's a particularly interesting result, and you want to make sure you have your name out there, that you've found it, and even if you know it's going to change and evolve over time, you may add new data to it. You may find that there were errors in it that you need to correct, but at least you've managed to sort of alert your field that research has been done, and maybe can also help them do their research more easily. It also serves, and this is something that we see that I think I hadn't thought too much about, but for a number of different labs, especially graduate students, a postdoc maybe who's moving throughout their career, it serves as a good way to document research results in advance of that formal publication. So where when I was in, so I have a science background, not chemistry, of microbiology, but when I was in graduate school and my postdoc, you would put on your CV, oh, I have a paper in preparation, or I'm going to submit it, but someone else can't really see that. They can't tell how much work has really gone into it and maybe what the key results are. Preprints allow that visibility. So people want them for grant applications or progress reports, things like that, where there's something that's citable, archived, publicly visible, that can be documented. And so that's all the advantages for the authors, but obviously people who read preprints have their own benefits. And staying on top of the latest research, I think, is probably the key one. Just gives you a sense of what's happening at a little faster speed than waiting for it to go through peer review. Doesn't mean that you have to immediately assume everything in it is perfect, right? But at least it gives you a sense of, the same way as you go to a conference or you would speak to someone in another lab and say, what are you working on? What are you finding? This gives you that sort of visibility in a little more equitable way, because you don't have to have run across them or have to know them personally. And then it does give visibility into the evolution of a research paper. And this I find when we talk to faculty or librarians who might be using preprints to teach students, right? To go through and say, well, let's review this preprint together. And then you can look at the finished paper after it's gone out in the journal. You can see what might have changed. It does provide some of that transparency. All right, can we go to the next slide? So we did specifically ask the ChemArchive community, and this included people who had posted preprints and who also were just chemists in the same sort of fields who hadn't yet posted a preprint. We asked them, of these sort of top choices, what did they see as the biggest benefit of posting a preprint? And I think this is really more from the author perspective, I'll admit. And I think you can see pretty clearly the answer was that sort of priority. People want credit for the work they've done. They don't want it necessarily to be hidden away while they're going back and forth in a peer review process. And then the rapid sharing was clear number two, and that really was shared across the board. I think people are able to appreciate that it moves a little faster, right? So I have I think a slide about our screening process, but at ChemArchive, typically about 1 business day to get a preprint up, excuse me, maybe 2, depending on volume or something like that, but moves pretty quick. All right, if you want to go to the next one. Okay, great. I thought that was it. All right. So I do think it's important to note that while preprints obviously are not, we are not doing peer review, we're not coordinating peer review. That is something that comes later should the authors wish to go that route. But we do some basic checks, and I think there's an important balance here that maybe we can discuss later as well, but not wanting to be a clearinghouse for any and all ideas that someone's able to just put on a sheet of paper. And this does vary by preprint service. And so for ChemArchive, for instance, we want something to be a research manuscript or a review. We don't accept just purely speculative sort of opinion pieces, at least at this point in time. So we go through just to make sure that all the sort of pieces of the manuscript are there, that the information about the authors, we do want there to be a clear way to contact the author, to know who they are, where they're affiliated. We don't look for how well the research was done, but we do have a chemist look at each preprint to make sure that it isn't just complete pseudoscience or something that could be potentially dangerous. And then for us, having a scope within chemistry and related fields, we are looking for the scope match. We're pretty broad. If something is going to be of any interest to someone who has sort of any chemistry in their research world, I think we'd be happy to post it. But if something comes through that is truly unrelated, we try to recommend a different outlet for them. So, and yeah, I think you mentioned we might want to touch on that peer review stuff later. So I'm good. I'll stop right there and we can move on. Thanks.
I have one very quick question for you, Ben, before I hand it over to Philip. You were doing the analogy between preprint posting and going to a conference. So couldn't help but notice, the spike in 2020, obviously there was no conferences for a couple of years because of COVID. Do you think it's related to that because of the lack of conferences that more people wanted to share in that way?
I think those are certainly correlated. I don't know if I could say that one causes the other, but I think everyone was, not just who were still in the research lab, we were all starved for interaction, I think, with the scientific community when travel was restricted and everyone was working at home for a while, labs were locked down. So I think that this just became one way as people were scouring for information and trying to learn what was up. We also saw a lot of people writing papers at that time, right? I think when you have data that you've already prepared, maybe you can't be in the lab doing what you would have done or in the field, but instead you take some time to write those results up. So I think it was all just sort of all commingled there, related there.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks very much for that. We'll discuss more later, but I'll hand over to Philip just now. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Romy. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks, Ben. It's interesting I'll just say about 2020. We had the same surge in 2020. You'll see a little bit on the graph that I have. I'll say more about that in a minute. Anyway, hi, hello, I'm Philip Cohen. I'm a sociologist and the director of SocIarchive. We're a paper server, not just preprints. And so the categories that Romy laid out, actually, we cover all of those, which is interesting. We include preprints, of course, but not just preprints. And then papers start as preprints, but then become something else over time on our server. SocIarchive, the SocIarchive is social science. So we cover all social sciences, but also humanities, education, and law. And those were that's where we saw us going when we started up in 2016. So we were part of the initial a surge of preprints when the Center for Open Science put up their preprint server in 2016. And since then, and so we were started by a group of sociologists and librarians and people in the library community. And since then, we've expanded to some other social sciences on our steering group, and also have been acquired by my library, thank goodness, the University of Maryland Libraries. So I'm an appointee of the Dean of Libraries now in my unpaid position here. So we're a nonprofit. We're not a nonprofit. We are a nonprofit. We're part of the university, academy owned, is how we put that. Open access, open source. The Center for Open Science platform is an open source platform, and like ChemArchive, free to read and to post. What we're providing people is the archiving and organization and storage, presentation of their metadata, a variety of licenses, formats, a few different document formats. People come to us because of the capacity we have for versioning, so papers evolve over time. We give DOIs, digital object identifiers, to the papers that we host. We also link the DOIs from the preprints that we host to the published papers in journals when those appear. And because we're on the Open Science framework, we also have the capacity for authors to upload and store and link to their research materials associated with a particular paper or project. So the link to the OSF project files is right there on the page, and I'll show you a little bit of that. Like ChemArchive, we're doing what you call light moderation, which is quite similar, it sounds like, to what you're doing. We have a group of volunteers. It usually does take us also between 1 minute and 1 day to finish, to get papers up. And we are checking to see, basically, are you who you say you are? Is this a piece of scholarship? Does it have any obvious copyright problems that we might want to discuss with you before we accept it? Is it, fraudulent or dangerous? Excuse me. We're not, but we're very clear that posting a paper on Social Archive is not really an accomplishment. The paper is the accomplishment. The posting it on Social Archive is just good stewardship of the work. And so I would not recommend it. You can keep up with what's going on in your field by looking at Social Archive, but it's I wouldn't browse Social Archive to know what's up with the best research in the world, because some of the things we accept are not really good research, and that's okay. So if you post on Social Archive if you're not afraid to have your work on the same shelf as something that's not as good as yours, and that's it's like the internet that way. Okay, I guess next one, please. So this is our this is just where we've started, where we've been, how it's going. You see the upturn there in 2020. This isn't really a great figure for that. Ben's was better, but it's interesting. We did have a surge in 2020 of papers, both reading and posting, and then some fall off since then. And actually, if you look across preprint servers, bioRxiv and medRxiv, and arXiv, the math and physics one, there was quite a marked diminishment of the growth of scholarly output in 2021. I'm pretty interested in that. We'll see if that's just that, like Ben says, people had data on the shelf and they pushed papers out, and then there's a lag as they catch up, or something else may have happened. Anyway, so that's where we are, about 12,000 papers. And we're running a handful of papers a day. Our increase is not quite as I'd like that bend to be a little steeper and to be increasing exponentially, but we're growing steadily. Okay, thank you. Next. So why are people sharing their papers on Social Archive in particularly? It's about efficiency and engagement and inclusivity or equity. There are long delays in publishing. Some social sciences, the publication delay itself can be over a year just between acceptance and publication, but the review times are also often very long. And the frustrating part for researchers is when they have completed a piece of work, they have a working draft, a complete draft of a piece of work, they're happy and proud, they're ready to send it out, and then everybody waits for months. And the frustrating thing is you're waiting for people who don't really want to read it often to read it. Editors are twisting arms. There's a real crisis, a backlog in peer review right now. And so right at the moment when your work is most relevant and has most important, really, right when it's been completed, the people who really want to read it can't. So that's probably the number one reason. Second is access. in the social sciences, we have a large contingent of researchers who are interested in public engagement, who want people outside academia to read their work, people in adjoining fields, people who don't have university subscriptions to read their work. And in addition to making it come out sooner, they wanted to come out more equitably and have a greater reach. So we do also host papers. Some people post their papers, they may post a preprint, but only after publication. So it's a preprint after publication. It's the preprint version, but after their journal version comes out, they realize it's behind a paywall. And rather than saying, email me and I'll send you a PDF, which is nice, but is much less inclusive than just giving everybody a link and letting them click. And then the connection, the fact that our, I'm finishing the last point. It's okay. The sense of connection that people get from sharing work, especially openness, and linking to the research materials is a part of that. So to own the timing, to make our distribution open, and to connect to other scholars and research materials. Okay, thank you. So here's what it looks like on the server. And this shows you a little bit of the evolution of how of the affordances we provide and how a paper evolves on the server. This is one of my papers, and you can see the elements of what's on the page highlighted there. There's some basic metrics, views and downloads. We have annotation service from Hypothesis, so people can make comments on papers, in context comments. And with Hypothesis, if you're not familiar with it, you can create private or public comments. So for example, a seminar could read a paper and have a group commenting on it in private so that only they can see their comments. We have the Plaudit endorsement button, which is sort of like individual peer review. If you want to endorse a paper on Social Archive, you can Plaudit it as long as you have an ORCID. There's the link to the supplemental materials that I mentioned that takes you to a folder on the OSF where the author has stored data and code, for example. You see the two DOIs there. There's the paper DOI that we assign the paper when it is posted. That's the OSF DOI on Social Archive. And then the second field there is for the author to use when the paper is published somewhere. They can put the publication DOI there. And this will help tell the world that these are the same, that these are two versions of the same paper. By the world, in practice, I often mean Google Scholar and the other aggregators, so that when you find this paper on Google Scholar, you will see the Social Archive version and the Socius, the journal version, listed as two of the versions on Google Scholar. This isn't automatically populated. It is on some others, but we do that. We leave that to the authors to do. There's the license that I've chosen, CC0. You have a variety of CC licenses to choose from. Our authors choose their own taxonomy in terms of subject areas and tags. In our moderation, we check that those are, the word we use on our moderation guidelines is plausible. We don't police that extremely rigorously. Some people like to use a lot of subject headings to increase their search traffic or something. I don't think it works very well, but that's what they try to do. We do, like Ben said, we do make sure the papers are somewhat in scope of the areas that we cover before we accept them. For example, some people may try to post medical research or physics or chemistry, for example, and unless those have a very clear social science tie-in, we don't accept those. And then the last arrow there you see is to the versioning, and what you're seeing here is the journal version. I published this in an open access journal that allows me to share the journal version. But if you clicked on that button there, you would see the previous versions. So the version history is preserved here, which is honestly not always what authors want. But we feel it's important for the scholarly record. You will always land, if you land on this, as the paper has evolved from a preprint to a paper under review to an accepted paper to now this published version, on Social Archive, it has always been the same paper. So landing on this URL has always brought you to the latest version, but you can look at the old versions. And so that's how we preserve the scholarly record at Social Archive. And if authors want to take down their papers, for example, they want to publish it in a journal that says you have to take down the preprint, we don't do that. The link is already out there. People are citing and reading it. We're not going to give them a dead link after having provided them a link. So authors need to think carefully about the future of their paper before they post it on Social Archive. Okay, last one. Common concerns, reasons that people are skeptical and about posting their work. Academics are interesting. They go back and forth sometimes between thinking their work is not good enough or thinking it's completely great. And those can actually both be reasons not to share something, but the not good enough is the more common one. Some people think that by posting work before it's peer reviewed, they're getting ahead of themselves, ahead of the process. They're undermining peer review. They're saying peer review doesn't matter. I think my work is great, that they'll be misread in that way. And so that's one of the culture changes that we're working on, honestly, to promote the idea that it's okay to make mistakes, but it's also to be proud of our work and share it, that peer review is an important part of the process, but peer review is not necessary before the dissemination of all work. You have to make a judgment call. If you're going to put up something up that's incendiary or inflammatory or dangerous or very speculative with important consequences, you should be very sure that it's in a state you're ready to share it, but it doesn't have to be. But most work that you're ready to send to a journal and have strangers read it, we think you're probably ready to share it with the public if you can get over that hurdle. Some people are concerned they won't be able to publish their work later. In social science, that's quite rare now that there are journals that refuse to consider work that has been posted as a preprint, although there are some. I would recommend you don't publish in those journals because they're not working in the public interest, but that's a matter of opinion. Anyway, you can look up the policies. And then there's the odd contradictory idea that someone will take my idea if I post it. Ben mentioned precedence, and that's a very important reason why you want to get your work out there. You put it up with a timestamp in a legitimate archive where the history of it is preserved and it is your idea on that date. If somebody's going to steal your work, they can do that wherever you publish it. They can do that if you publish it in a minor journal. They can do it if you mention it at a conference. They can do it if they're a member of your dissertation committee and they have the capacity to publish things faster than you do. Having your ideas taken can happen a lot of different ways. We find we recommend doing it publicly to protect yourself, to get to associate yourself with the ideas as early as possible. Although we do acknowledge that there are risks to that, and we don't want to pretend that they don't exist. But in most cases, we think you're better off doing it in public. And I think that's the last one. Yes, good. So thank you. I'm looking forward to some Q&A after this.
Thank you so much, Philip. I also have an immediate question for you, if you don't mind. Just to go back to what I said at the start about the versions, when we looked at this is your paper, and from what I can tell, that's the kind of final published version. Is that correct?
Yep.
And so if I want to see the AAM, or maybe you submitted that first as a preprint before you submitted it to a journal, but this is essentially the same version that's also published in a journal, right?
Yes, this what you're looking at on that screen is the journal PDF, which I have uploaded here, and which this journal allows. Some journals would not. But if you're that thing on the writing on the very bottom there says version 5. If you clicked on that in the paper, you could look at version 4, which was the AAM, and version 3, which was the submitted version. So I uploaded them as the paper evolved.
And is this then in the actual journal? Is it published open access or closed access?
Open access.
Open access. And this is why you'd given it a certain license, the same license that you published it under in the journal.
Right. Yeah, it's a little interesting actually. The paper had a CC0 license before I submitted it to the journal. So that my understanding is that the journal can't change that status of the earlier versions. I actually don't know what would happen if the journal, it could be their version could be published with a different license, and then I don't know what would be the correct thing to display on this page, because it does actually have different versions on this page. That's a good question.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting, having all these versions in one place. In a way, in my head, that almost makes it more of a subject repository than just a preprint server.
Exactly.
Would you agree?
Yeah. Yes, it's both. And it's actually interesting. I mean, we prefer this. If you post a paper on bioRxiv or medRxiv, or I suppose chemRxiv, when the paper is published in a journal, there may be a forward link. But if somebody goes to that old URL, they can still land on the old version first. And we're trying to prevent that. That is, I don't want somebody who was given this link during the year or two that it took for me to get it published to go back to that old version and read and cite that version by accident, not knowing that there's a newer version. And in fact, right, if I had sent it to bioRxiv after it was accepted, they would reject it for that reason. They don't accept papers that are already that have already been peer reviewed, even if they haven't been published.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. Thanks for clarifying that. Before we head into the discussion, I just wanted to share one little thing about what Chronos Hub does in relation to preprints. So we have an integration with SciArchive, which is hosted on COS, and therefore the APA journals. If you've posted your preprint, you can then decide to submit straight into the APA journals through Chronos Hub. So roundabout way involving lots of different players, and I had to dig a little bit, but there's actually really good instructions on how to do this. You log in, you choose your preprint, and then you can see here on the screen, you can choose with one of the 7 journals, and then it takes you almost through Chronos Hub where you create an account, and then that sends it straight to APA. And I think, Ben, you're doing something similar as well.
Yeah, we do. We do have a direct journal transfer system that connects directly from chemRxiv to, I think it's about 160 chemistry journals at the moment. So it started with our partners, but we've recently expanded beyond just the organizations that co-own chemRxiv. And yeah, it transfers basically a package with the manuscript file and some basic metadata, author names, affiliations. We don't collect as much information as chemistry journals do, so there still is almost always a step the author needs to take with the journal to finish the information they need or sign a form or assert certain things. But yes, we do have a system that goes basically it's a couple clicks out of our, if you log into chemRxiv, choose your preprint, within a couple clicks you can send it to a journal.
Can I ask a question about that, actually? That's great to see this, because that's on our platform. So that means that this is, it's possible for us to do this also on SocialArchive. On bioRxiv, and I don't want to speak for them, but I'm pretty sure the journals are paying bioRxiv to have their name on that drop-down list. And they wouldn't want to be, it's actually part of the sustainability of the preprint platform is that it is providing a service to the journals that is worth something to the journals. And I think that's great. By paying, I mean, I think that's great. I'm looking for ways to make the preprint servers sustainable. And I wonder if for either the SciArchive or the chemRxive, if you're willing to divulge, do the journals pay for that?
Yeah, we do also have a small fee for journals to help support the integration, the setting up the transfer and such. Yeah,
that's great. And they obviously have an incentive to do that, because if it's so convenient, then they would be at a disadvantage if they weren't on that list. Anyway, I think that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is something that the publisher set up. So from our side as well, it's APA that have set this up and are paying for that essentially. So any publisher that might look for submissions from a certain subject, they could have an integration, I think, with any other, at least a COS preprint service, and have that set up if it's relevant for their journals to get submissions into the journals. And I don't know if that's something, like you said, Philip, that because your SocialArchive is also hosted on COS, so that's something you could do. Obviously, social science is perhaps a little bit broader in terms of which publishers and which journals, but is that something you think there's value in this kind of service to make it easier?
Yes, I do. I mean, you've seen the cascade publishing model that publishers use, where if it's rejected by one journal, they send it to a lower, less selective journal that they also host. I think it's a similar sort of vertical integration concept with the preprint server. And I know Sage, for example, has put up a preprint server that they've tried that is where you can submit to their own journals in social science. I think it's called Sage Advances or something. So it certainly, there is an incentive, and ChemArchive was started by the publishers. So there certainly is an incentive to link them together for the convenience of the authors, but I think it also is good for the scholarly record that the paper has a consistent identity and lives. It evolves through the process. It's a little tricky because the version of record is the version of record model of publishing is that a piece of research is one and only one thing at the end, but it's not really the way research works anymore. And so what we're trying to do, I think, is come up with ways to work within the existing ecosystem, but also acknowledge the way research has changed with technology.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. We kind of moved on to discussion already. One of the things that, before we get to these questions that we talked about, one of the things at the tip of my tongue, and we didn't talk about this in the prep call, but I was looking more into the new OSTP memo, and when I was reading into it, it was talking a lot about making things openly available, and you talked about this, Philip. Ben, you said it's all about open dissemination. Is preprint posting going to be in line with that memo and that recommendation? Because from what I understand, it's talking more about making openly available rather than publishing open access as such in a journal. What are your thoughts on that?
I got to say, I've signed up for some webinars and things of my own just to kind of continue to hear people's thoughts. From what I've discussed, I feel like we don't know yet how the U.S. government is planning to define a lot of the things that they've written in there. So they could say, yes, if you have a preprint that's the equivalent work, that counts. They could say, no, it has to be the accepted manuscript. That's certainly the way it reads to me, is that they're really talking more about the author accepted manuscript being available somewhere. But they could even dial it up and say, no, the final piece needs to be available somewhere. And I think they haven't actually really defined that. And perhaps it may even vary by the granting agency. Sort of the memo is to all granting agencies, and they may allow some variability among them. So I think to be determined, probably a straight preprint that's the way early is not really going to fulfill what the government had asked for.
Right. I mean, there is an equity issue there. If your mandate is to make the author accepted manuscript open, but you still have paywalled final typeset versions, which may be of higher quality in some ways. I mean, obviously you're adding value. You're paying to have it turned into that, so you must be making it better in some way, right? And also, and there may also be errors in the. I mean, if you a straight preprint. A pre-review preprint clearly would not meet the spirit of the mandate because it could be wrong. It's not the final version. But I think I think they probably are going for something like the AAM. And I think if you look at the PubMed history where NIH has been doing this, I think that might end up serving as a model. And that's what they do on PubMed is the author accepted versions.
Yeah, interesting. It's just a thought that came to me because there's a lot of discussion about this topic, and I'm going to Charleston next week, and I've also signed up to some session, Ben, and some people ask me questions about it, and I think you're right, there's still not enough, but I feel like everyone is going to read into it something slightly different, possibly. Let's dive into the first question just briefly on subject areas, just because we have the kind of two subject areas here. Do you think there's some subjects where preprints are more valued than others, or some that are maybe less, where they've been preprint servers, but there's not been any posting?
I think that probably the value exists universally, but it's about certain fields where the research community does not yet maybe understand that benefit or lean into it the same way. It may not be quite as urgent for them as other fields. So I think we see, biology exploded. Physics was obviously first, and now you have almost near saturation for something like astronomy. 80-90% of all published papers in that field start as an archive preprint. So they were 25 years ago at this point, something like that. So they've really kind of just been ingrained in the community. And I think others are moving in that direction, but it takes a little bit of time. What I can speak to is within chemistry and chemical fields, we do see variability, and fields that are closer to that physical chemistry, computational, the sort of archive world, they were the first to come over, and those are the sort of the areas that we saw lots of theoretical paper preprints. And then over time, sort of other areas have started to catch up. So just recently for us, nanoscience became, and material science became like more of our popular categories, overtaking the sort of theoretical and physical chemistry kind of worlds. But we do have areas like organic chemistry, so synthesis. If someone has discovered how to synthesize something that may be patentable, they don't want the preprint up until they've managed to like, apply for the patent structure that may need to be there, because otherwise somebody could quickly synthesize it. And that is a place where we do hear from our authors that they have concerns about intellectual property. So that's a field that's lagging behind and may continue to lag behind because it has some sort of other other factors to consider.
Yeah, I agree. I think the differences are mostly cultural, with a few practical situations like that. In the more in history and the book disciplines, it's different. People who are writing books and not articles are less likely to post their work. But even people who are writing books and articles in those areas, it's less valued, I suppose. But I don't think there's a major structural reason. Like economics has a long history of well-regarded working paper series that go back to the print days. And I think it's, and it served them very well. But I think it's just a question of sort of the research culture more than anything.
Thanks. Yeah, let's dive into we've talked about open access already, but a little bit more about preprint posting and the relationship between that and open access publishing. Philip, you've mentioned journals where they would ask you to take the preprint down. So I assume that's when you publish closed access and the preprint has been posted, that they would ask you to remove that openly available version. So that's one of the conflicts there. I think you've also hinted at the fact that some authors might feel like they have less of a need to publish open access if they have a preprint available. Is that your experience?
I think, one of the things that we've said, and we say in our public our social media campaigns, is that there's no reason to pay an APC charge at a hybrid journal if you can post a preprint, or there's less reason to. That is, if the paper's already going to be published and you can provide close to the final version for free, paying thousands of dollars for the open access seems like not worth it. So I think there is some of that relationship. We've had some interesting situations about the take down your preprint. Those are old policies. We had one situation where an editor was enforcing it, even though it was no longer the publisher's policy. Editors don't always know what their publisher policies are. Academic editors. So there's some confusion out there as far as what's appropriate and what's feasible. But I think we're quickly sorting it out, and I don't think that confusion is gonna last for very long. And I think one of the things that's actually happening as far as the link between preprints and open access, which you mentioned at the beginning, is preprint review, and I think that will be that will help move this along. And we've had, for example, Peer Community In is a suite of journals that are essentially overlay journals, where they publish a list of preprints that they have accepted, but they don't publish the papers. And some of them are on Social Archive, like Peer Community In Archaeology says, this paper, we accept this paper, which is available on Social Archive. Anyway, so that's open access publishing, but we're the host of the actual document.
Yeah, so you had asked when we talked about sort of the preparation, the link between our authors selecting open access. If they post a preprint, are they more likely to use open access or not? And from the data that we have, at least to ACS journals, where that's where I have my day job. It looks like the sort of proportion of preprints that wind up in open access is pretty similar to the proportion of what's published open access. So I think there might be sort of competing forces where I think in some cases, someone, they've already got the preprint up. They don't really feel the need to maybe go and push for it to be open access. In other cases, they might like open access and want to support the transparency of the whole path. And maybe those factors kind of push and pull a little bit. But one related piece is that when we did our survey, we asked, if you're putting a preprint up, do you already have a destination journal in mind? And for chemistry, the overwhelming answer was yes. So for 70% of people, they say every single time I post a preprint, I already know where I'm submitting. And for another 25, they said most of the time they know where they're submitting. So I think what we're seeing, I guess, is that if in chemistry, it's just reflecting what the top journals or what the journal destinations are. And as those become more and more open access, we'll see more and more preprints that are going there.
I think that's also consistent with the research that's finding that the main results and conclusions rarely change between preprints and published versions, which is sort of an indication that the preprints people are posting are usually the version they are submitting to a journal. And that's why the journal submission thing is working. And in that sense, it's really accelerating it's accelerating the process. And I think preprints are playing a very valuable role in that case. Some of those papers, turn out to be wrong and are rejected, or are not accepted at the top journals, but work their way through a process. So they're sweeping up some lower quality work, you could say, but also some work which is just not destined for a high status journal, but maybe perfectly adequate. A null finding, a boring finding, a small piece of a spin-off from a larger project where somebody says, I've done posting as a preprint is all I need to do, to get it off my chest, and I can move on.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I've heard as well of publishers actively going out to preprint service to look for articles that would suit their journals, right?
Yeah, if you ever post a paper on medRxiv, you will get emails from journals you never heard of.
Yeah. No, I mean, we even posted, we did a fifth anniversary editorial, and I posted it on ChemArchive, and just to look at our numbers over the past 5 years and things. And I get random solicitations for that at this point. Yeah, no, it is definitely true. I think in chemistry, again, it isn't as common because it seems like in most cases authors kind of they're already in that process, and maybe they've already even submitted it and are just putting the copy up. And so but it does happen. I know we talk to our authors and they do get requests.
Are there any other issues that you've heard of that you've encountered with, changes in licenses or people having to make changes as a result of their publishing choice? So one is, you said, journals asking preprints to be taken down, which I know, Philip, you said you're not doing, and you need to think about that really before you post it, or any other implications in that regard?
Well, so we have on occasion removed a preprint and left a note explaining it. We do our darndest not to do that. So typically we kind of say exactly the same as, sometimes there are like legal issues or something like that, like information that should not have ever been shared, wasn't owned by the author, something like that. But generally, I guess I would say in terms of licensing, the license we really can't change, right? So we use Creative Commons licenses also. If sometime later they want to create a later version, they can do that, but they can't come back and then say, oh, well, now we have to restrict this old piece. Because I mean, once you've licensed something to be, freely reused, it's out there. And if someone has a copy of it with that license on it, there really is no way to retroactively change that. So,
and are all preprints assigned a license? Because I know AAM posting, for example, is usually not really under a license if you post in an institutional repository, because that's an issue with some of the whole funder mandates, like UKI needs to be, if you're in the UK, if you post, like posting in in an institutional repository is acceptable, but it needs to have a CC BY license, and a lot of publishers haven't bothered attaching a license. So that's where my question is kind of coming from. As a preprint server, if someone posts, is there a license then, or what's the agreement? What does it say legally?
Well, you're giving us a license to distribute it when you post it. You can't, but on Social Archive and the OSF preprints, you can post a paper with no license. And that is, you can choose that as your option. And then I guess it is, I'm not actually sure exactly what that implies for, I assume that means people cannot further distribute it. Then it would just be copyrighted to you, and that's it. You've given us a license to distribute it, so it lives there. I think that's right.
Yeah, that's right. And so at ChemArchive, we do actually ask authors to choose a Creative Commons license that is an expression of their rights to the work, right? So exactly as Philip pointed out, within the terms, it says you're allowing us to hold it in perpetuity and archive it and post it, but we're then saying you're going to retain rights, choose how much you want to grant to any reader, so we do have a couple of the variations.
So you can use a non-commercial license if you want to, and then the preprint is protected in that way.
Yeah, but we do make them choose one of those, and then that is different from other places where you can choose no license, which means you retain full rights to it, except what you've granted to the platform to post it.
It's interesting because I think one of the approaches to the open access on universities is rights retention policies. We have one at Maryland now where faculty research, the university has a license to distribute faculty research forever before they submit it to a journal. And I think that's similar to having posted it on Social Archive before submitting it to a journal. The journal can produce a version that has a restrictive copyright on it, copyright on it. But they can't take away the license that already existed. So complicated.
Yes, very. And I think a lot of authors are very confused about licenses when it comes to publishing. So I know for preprints it must be the same, but I was wondering if there's any restrictions.
And one of the issues I think is that the difference between law and ethics here. I mean, people are afraid. Authors worry about licenses because they're worried about plagiarism and things like that. But those are really ethical and professional issues. If somebody plagiarizes your work, they can do it. It's unethical or illegal for them to do that, whether you have published it with a CC0 license or not. They're still violating their professional norms and ethics. But it's a little tricky. Like if you put a CC0 license on something, you're not saying you're letting somebody put their name on it and submit it to another journal. That would still be wrong.
Yeah, of course.
And you could probably even sue them for that, but that's not the issue. You don't sue people over plagiarism. That's very rare. Most of what you want to do is you just want appropriate credit and you want to, have them be fired or something.
And I mean, for plagiarism checking, you have tools like Turnitin or the Crossref equivalent for publishers, and I know a lot of papers get run through that system before even being considered. Do you know if preprints are being scanned at all for any of those plagiarism checks?
We do scan just to make sure it isn't something that's been copied completely wholesale. I mean, there are nuances there. If it's a publicly available thesis for one of the authors that they're reusing, that's one of the things actually that I liaise most commonly with the curation team about. Is they'll say, got this, let's discuss whether we feel like there's anything concerning in it. But we personally do. I think the bioRxiv and archive do, but
so you scan published material to see if it has been published before you post it on preprint. My question was actually, do you know if that kind of service scans not just published material but also preprint service, the other way around?
Yeah,
like
it does.
Submit it to Cell. Do they scan the preprint servers to see if someone else is?
I mean, ChemArchive shows up in like Authenticate. So
does it? Okay, that was my question. Yeah. Authenticate.
So, and what we've run into sometimes is authors will say, I got told by the journal it's already published, and it's because they
me.
saw that it was in ChemArchive,
Yeah.
and it's like, okay, well, and that's where I just try to provide some information, or let them copy me on a reply, and I can explain, we're not a journal, we did not do peer review, like this is what was going on. And typically that helps, but it does show up in Authenticate, and that does create some confusion sometimes.
It is bad hygiene, but we don't have a rule against people posting the same paper on multiple preprint servers. So we do a plagiarism check by hand. We just Google the title and look at the results. And so we're probably missing some things, but we do often see that some people who are just trying to get their work everywhere will post it on Zenodo, and they'll post it on SSRN, and they're like trying to post their paper everywhere. And we allow that. I know bioRxiv, I think, does not. If you posted it on another preprint server, they don't want it. And it's not a good practice, because of, it's just a mess. But we don't have a rule against it. But it is tricky if there's one author, two authors, right, dissertations, and so on.
I've got one more question that just popped up in my head. Philip, one of your screenshots, you had some information about usage statistics, how many views there have been. Is that something you provide to all your authors? And is that something that is also, fed to other bodies? So one of the reasons I'm asking at Charleston next week, I've got a question about usage statistic tracking. And I know for the book side, they look more at usage stats from different version of the book, as in where different locations where it's been posted. And I think for journals, that's not really happened yet. We're looking more at usage statistic of the final published paper and perhaps at the institutional repository. But I don't know if I don't think anyone is looking at, okay, one paper, different versions, put it all together, how much usage has there been?
No, well, Google Scholar will aggregate the citations, but not the views and downloads, right? Right. Okay. So we provide that in all papers. We've actually chosen not to pay for altmetrics. We could, if we raised a little money and want to spend it that way, OSF would provide us with altmetrics link for our papers, but views and downloads is all we have. And you can, if you know how to use APIs, you could scrape that stuff off our server yourself and do rankings and comparisons and stuff like that. So that's all open. And
is that the same for all the cost preprints, I imagine?
Yes. Yeah, it's definitely underlying, and I think they automatically display it unless they ask not to, but I think they all do.
Yeah, we display views and downloads for every single preprint, and we also have a public API. So if anyone is interested, and I've been part of a Crossref advisory group that is not exactly going to solve everything we've discussed today, but we're starting to have conversations about how do we all make sure our metadata links, like when we identify that there is a quote version of record, how do we set up so that Crossref can see that? And that we could start to build a world in which you could connect more of the metadata together. So yeah.
The other piece of that is author identification, and we don't require authors to have an ORCID, but we would like to. So we're hopefully going to end up at that place where the author linkage is more automated and secure also. Yeah. For us, the person submitting ORCID is our authentication to log into the site. So the person submitting it has to have one. Yeah. And that does help. The other co-authors at this point, we don't, but we're exploring that as well.
Yeah, great. Lots of interesting stuff there. We're nearing the end of the hour. So just a last chance for both of you, either of you, any plans, what's next, any challenges, opportunities that you see ahead for your organization or the preprint space?
So I think that what I just mentioned, that sort of metadata and information exchange, is an area that we're definitely focusing and trying to build our infrastructure and our connections so that people can understand preprints as a tightly bound part of publishing and not something totally separate if they want to open it up. So that's probably one of the biggest pieces.
Yeah, same for us. And I think that would be good for just security and confidence. I also want to be able to improve integration with institutional repositories, because scholars tend to think in terms of disciplinary terms. I want my discipline to know about this, but their institutions might want to hold the work. So I'd like to have institutional repository integrations. And I also do want to get that journal thing going. So.
Yeah, I really liked your screenshot to get a visual on what it looks like and seeing all those different versions connected in one place. And I think that's what having my head about usage, that we would be able to do that in some stage. And yeah, more like one step, maybe the first step in the whole process, and that's not where it ends. And like you said, Phil, you know, maybe some preprints that are posted are not going to be published in a journal in the end because they're just not good enough, but others are. So it's been really useful and really interesting to learn more about how it all connects in one go. So thank you so much for that. Just going to wrap up. If you're not already on our newsletter or events list, we've got monthly webinars. We've got one more coming up in November about open access and research metrics. In January, we have scheduled a publisher workshop around workflows, and there'll be some new webinars coming in the new year as well. They haven't been announced yet. If you're interested to learn more about Chronos Hub, book a demo, or interested about possible integrations that we talked about, please get in touch. But that's everything. Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you, Philip. And any questions? We've not had any questions in the chat, otherwise they would have mentioned it, but any questions, feel free to email and I'll pass it on to our speakers.
Thank you. Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Thanks so much, Romy. Appreciate it. Good talking to you, Ben.
Thank you.